Year 1644, Beijing. Emperor Chongzhen walks alone through the empty corridors of the Forbidden City. Outside, rebels are setting the gates on fire. The imperial treasury is empty. The soldiers have deserted. The oldest empire in the world is hours away from total collapse. But it wasn't the invaders who destroyed China. It wasn't war, it wasn't famine. It was a silent debt that grew for centuries, a corruption that rotted every province, an inequality that turned subjects into enemies. And today the world's greatest economic power is repeating the same mistakes. Only the names of the dynasties have changed. Before we continue, make sure you're already subscribed to the channel and write in the comments where you're watching this video from. I love knowing how far these stories reach. To understand how China fell, you need to understand what it once was. For almost 2,000 years, China was the richest country in the world. That's not an exaggeration. It's a verified historical fact. While Europe lived through the Dark Ages, China already had paper money, gunpowder, compasses, and cities with over 1 million inhabitants. The Silk Road connected the empire to the entire world. Chinese silk, Chinese porcelain, Chinese tea, luxuries that European kings paid for in pure gold. At the height of the Tang dynasty, in the 8th century, the capital Chang'an was the largest city on the planet. More than 2 million people, markets that never closed. Poets, philosophers, engineers, astronomers. China wasn't just an empire, it was civilization itself, and the system worked for one fundamental reason: trust. Trust in the currency, trust in the emperor, trust in the celestial order. The concept was powerful. The Son of Heaven ruled because heaven allowed it. If there was chaos, famine, or war, it meant the emperor had lost the mandate of heaven, and when that happened, the people had the sacred right to rebel. It was a silent social contract, but an extraordinarily powerful one. In the 11th century, China's economy represented 25% of the world's GDP. A quarter of all the planet's wealth was concentrated in a single empire. Emperors lived in jade palaces. Mandarins wore silk embroidered with golden threads. The imperial granaries stored enough rice to feed millions for years. The world looked at China with admiration and envy. But behind the glory, something deadly was growing in silence. A mistake that no dynasty would be able to avoid. A cycle that would repeat for 1,000 years, always in the same devastating way. The mistake began with an apparently brilliant idea. If we print more money, we'll have more wealth. It was the Song dynasty in the 11th century that invented paper money. And at first it worked perfectly. Trade exploded. Cities grew exponentially. The Chinese economy became the most dynamic in the known world. But then came temptation. Wars against Mongol invaders, construction of monumental palaces, tribute payments to enemies, a bloated bureaucracy growing like a tumor, widespread corruption at every level of government. The solution? Print more and more and more. They minted promises and called them wealth, and it works until it stops working. Because the problem isn't paper money itself. The problem is that governments always discover it's easier to print than to produce. During the Yuan dynasty, founded by the Mongols in the 13th century, inflation was so brutal that paper money lost 90% of its value in just 3 decades. Merchants refused government payments. Soldiers received wages that couldn't buy even a sack of rice. And when the currency dies, trust dies with it. But this was only the beginning of the nightmare, because the second mistake was even worse: systemic, bureaucratic corruption. China had the most sophisticated administrative system in the ancient world. Imperial exams selected the best scholars to govern entire provinces. It was pure meritocracy, in theory. In practice, it was a sophisticated black market. Bureaucratic positions were bought with gold. Taxes were diverted into private accounts. Officials sold protection to the rich and crushed the poor with impossible tax burdens. The system rotted from within. A Chinese proverb from the time said, "Officials are like ants, individually harmless, but in swarms they devour the entire granary." And the more corrupt the bureaucracy became, the more taxes were needed to sustain it. And the higher the taxes, the more rebellions erupted in the provinces. The Ming dynasty inherited this poisoned system. They tried to reform it. Corrupt officials were executed publicly. New legal codes were implemented. But it was like trying to stop an avalanche with your hands. Because the problem was structural. The Chinese imperial system depended on a massive bureaucracy to administer the world's most populous territory. And any bureaucracy large enough eventually becomes corrupt. That was when the empire began to die, and no one noticed. Emperors celebrated military victories while the provinces bled in debt. Mandarins built mansions while peasants sold their children to pay tributes. The facade was glorious, the internal structure was rotten, and the third mistake sealed the empire's fate: extreme inequality. The fall of an empire is never sudden. It is slow, silent, invisible, until it no longer is. The Ming dynasty came to power in 1368, promising order and prosperity after the Mongol chaos. And for a century, it delivered. The Great Wall was rebuilt with bricks instead of earth. The Forbidden City was erected as a symbol of celestial power. Naval fleets of more than 300 ships sailed as far as East Africa. China was once again the undisputed center of the civilized world. But beneath the shining surface, the cracks deepened each day. First came uncontrolled military expansion, wars against the Japanese, Mongols, pirates. Each battle cost millions of tiles of silver. The imperial treasury shrank year after year, campaign after campaign. But that still wasn't the worst part. Then came brutal, systematic inequality. In the 16th century, 2% of China's population controlled 80% of the arable land. Peasants worked from sunrise to sunset and still couldn't feed their families. Meanwhile, mandarins amassed fortunes in silk, jade, and gold. The elite paid no taxes. The poor paid for everyone. Sound familiar? The tax laws were designed to protect wealthy landowners. Local officials were bribed to ignore massive tax evasion. The tax burden fell exclusively on the weakest. An average peasant gave 40% of his harvest to the government. Wealthy landowners, less than 5%. But the final blow was yet to come. In 1627, a climate crisis struck China with devastating force. The Little Ice Age, droughts that lasted for years, deadly winters, failed harvests across the northern provinces. The government had no reserves. The treasury was empty after decades of excessive military spending. Corruption had devoured everything else. And when the people begged for help, the empire demanded more taxes. Taxes on land, taxes on food, taxes on seeds, taxes on the dead. Families sold their children in slave markets to pay overdue tributes. The northern provinces turned into hellscapes of famine. Mothers drowned newborn babies because they couldn't feed them. The elderly committed suicide to reduce the number of mouths to feed, and the imperial government in Beijing, 1,000 kilometers away, debated ceremonies and protocol. Then in 1628, a man named Li Zicheng led a rebellion of starving peasants. He wasn't a trained general. He wasn't a noble with armies. He wasn't a military strategist. He was an unemployed mail carrier. But millions followed him because he promised something devastatingly simple: food and justice. His army grew like a plague. Every starving village joined. Every abandoned province rebelled. Every unpaid soldier deserted and joined the uprising. In 15 years, his rebel army conquered half of China, but that still wasn't the end. Because while Li Zicheng advanced from the west, another enemy waited in the north: the Manchus. The Manchus were a warrior people who had watched China's chaos with the patience of hunters. They knew the empire was collapsing. They were simply waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and in 1644, that moment came. Li Zicheng marched on Beijing with an army of starving peasants and deserters. The imperial capital, the largest city in Asia, fell without significant resistance. Emperor Chongzhen tried to flee. He ordered his family to commit suicide to avoid humiliation. He tried to negotiate with the rebels. He tried to beg his generals. But no one stood by his side. The ministers had fled with whatever gold they could carry. The generals had deserted or sold themselves to the highest bidder. The treasury was completely empty. At dawn on April 25, 1644, the emperor climbed to the top of Coal Hill in the imperial garden behind the Forbidden City. He wrote one last letter with trembling ink. "I am insignificant and lack virtue. I have offended heaven. My ministers deceived me. I die ashamed before my ancestors." Then he hanged himself from a tree with his own silk sash. The Ming dynasty ended not with an epic battle, but with a silent suicide in an empty garden. Because when money dies, the empire dies with it. Picture the scene with your eyes closed. Beijing, 1644. The largest city in Asia. The center of the civilized world. Empty streets covered in ash. Abandoned markets with overturned stalls. Looted palaces with shattered treasures on the floor. Copper coins scattered through the streets. worthless. Imperial debt certificates used as paper to wrap rotten food. Unpaid soldiers wandering like ghosts, looking for something to steal. Li Zicheng entered the Forbidden City as a conqueror. He sat on the throne of the Son of Heaven. He proclaimed a new dynasty with great ceremony. But it lasted exactly 42 days, because he made exactly the same mistake. He had no money to pay his rebel soldiers. The army that had brought him to power abandoned him when the promised gold never arrived. And then the Manchus came from the north, a warrior people who seized the chaos to invade. They crossed the Great Wall because a traitorous Chinese general opened the gates for them. They conquered Beijing in a matter of weeks. They founded the Qing dynasty, which would rule China for the next 268 years. But the cycle never stopped. Corruption, debt, inequality, rebellion, collapse. The Qing dynasty fell in exactly the same way in 1912, after the Boxer Rebellion and the Opium Wars that drained the imperial treasury, and the Republic of China that followed. It collapsed into brutal civil wars and catastrophic inflation in the 1940s. Banknotes that weren't even worth the paper they were printed on. Each regime promised celestial order. Each regime repeated the same fatal mistakes, because the problem was never the specific dynasty, it was the entire system. And now, the question everyone is thinking, could this happen today? The devastating answer, it's already happening. Let's look at the real numbers. Modern China has a total debt, government plus corporations plus households, of approximately 300% of GDP. That's nearly $50 trillion in absolute numbers. For direct comparison, the Ming Dynasty went bankrupt with a debt of about 200% of GDP. Modern China has already passed the historical breaking point, but it's not just the debt. It's the entire pattern, it's systemic bureaucratic corruption. Between 2012 and 2024, the Chinese government has punished more than 4.7 million officials for corruption, 4,700,000. And those are only the ones who were caught and publicly prosecuted. Government positions are still bought with bribes disguised as gifts. Public contracts are still negotiated at secret banquets. The elite still protect themselves while the population foots the entire bill. An internal report from the Chinese Communist Party, leaked in 2023, estimated that corruption costs China between 3% and 5% of GDP annually. That's between $500 billion and $850 billion that simply vanish every year. And then there's the explosive inequality. Today, the richest 1% of China's population controls 31% of the country's total wealth. China's Gini coefficient, a measure of inequality, is 0.47, worse than the United States. China's middle class, which sustained the economic miracle for 3 decades, is stagnant. Real wages haven't grown since 2019. Housing prices are 40 times higher than the average annual income in major cities. And what are young Chinese doing? They're embracing movements like Tangping, lying flat, rejecting the rat race, refusing to work 996, 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, for crumbs, or Bailan, let it rot. Total abandonment of the system, because they've realized something fundamental. The system is no longer for them. The Chinese dream has turned into a nightmare for an entire generation. They thought they were too big to fall. Ming thought so, Qing thought so, the Republic thought so. And today the Chinese Communist Party thinks so. But history doesn't care about the name of the regime. It cares about structural patterns. And the pattern is crystal clear. When you print money without limit, when corruption corrodes institutional trust, when inequality explodes beyond the point of return, collapse becomes mathematically inevitable. It may take a decade, it may take a century, but it always happens. Now look at the United States. A national debt of $36 trillion, 128% of GDP and rising. Unlimited money printing since the 2008 crisis. Inequality at levels unseen since 1929, just before the Great Depression. The richest 1% of Americans control 32% of the wealth, virtually identical to China. Look at Europe. Bankrupt countries artificially sustained by European central bank debt. Corrosive inflation destroying wages. Massive protests in the streets of France, Italy, Spain. Look at Latin America. Argentina with triple-digit inflation. Brazil with explosive debt. Venezuela completely collapsed. Look at Japan. Debt at 260% of GDP, the highest in the developed world. The same fatal cycle. The same historical mistakes. Only the names of the currencies and the titles of the leaders have changed. And the most terrifying part of all this, China knows exactly what's happening. The Chinese government obsessively studies the collapses of ancient dynasties. They have entire departments dedicated to analyzing why each imperial regime fell. They know that the mandate of heaven still exists. Now it's called political legitimacy or social stability. And they know perfectly well that without sustainable economic growth, that legitimacy evaporates like water in the desert. That's why they invest trillions in colossal infrastructure projects. That's why they control the internet with total censorship. That's why they crush any dissent before it grows. That's why they implement social credit systems to control behavior. Because they've watched the entire historical film 1,000 times. And they know exactly how it ends. The only problem is that knowing history doesn't make you immune to repeating it, because the incentives of power are always the same. Maintain short-term control, no matter the long-term consequences. Every Chinese dynasty knew corruption would destroy the empire, but every corrupt official prioritized his family over the empire. Every dynasty knew that printing money caused inflation, but every emperor needed to pay the army today, not worry about the economy tomorrow. Every dynasty knew that inequality sparked rebellion, but every elite class protected its privileges until the very last moment. And today, every modern government knows the current path is unsustainable. But political incentives demand kicking the crisis further down the road. So what did we learn from the collapse of Imperial China? 3 lessons that should be carved in stone. First lesson: no empire is too big to fall. It doesn't matter how many centuries it lasted. It doesn't matter how many innovations it created. It doesn't matter how much power it accumulated. When the economic foundations rot, collapse becomes a matter of mathematical time. Rome fell, Spain fell, Great Britain fell. Every Chinese dynasty fell. Why would the current system be any different? Second lesson: corruption is deadlier than any invading army, because an external enemy unites the people against a common threat. But internal corruption divides. It corrodes trust. It turns citizens into enemies. It destroys the government's moral legitimacy. It wasn't the Mongols who destroyed the Ming. It was the corrupt officials who emptied the treasury while the people starved. Third lesson: when money dies, everything dies with it. Currency isn't just paper or metal. It's solidified trust. It's the collective belief that the future will be better than the present. And when that belief breaks, entire empires crumble within years. Imperial China didn't fall because it was invaded by superior enemies. It fell because it became economically unsustainable. Too much debt, too much corruption, too much inequality. And today, the world's largest economies are following the exact same path, printing money with no real backing, feeding bureaucracies that no longer serve the people, creating inequalities that can only be maintained through repression. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes with poetic precision. And that rhyme is growing clearer, louder, more inevitable. The greater the empire, the quieter the fault that destroys it. No one notices when money begins to lose real value. No one perceives when corruption becomes fully normalized. No one feels when inequality becomes irreversible, until suddenly everyone feels it, all at once. And by then, it's too late to prevent the collapse. Emperor Chongzhen didn't see the fall until his final night. Rome didn't see its collapse until the barbarians entered the gates. Spain didn't see its bankruptcy until the gold stopped arriving from the Americas. Empires never see their own death until they are already dead. The empire fell, but the lesson remained, written in blood and ash. And the question that defines our time is devastatingly simple. Have we finally learned, or are we doomed to repeat the same cycle once again? We'll know the answer in this decade. Because numbers don't lie, patterns don't lie, history doesn't lie, and they're all saying the same thing. The next empire in our series shows how the most powerful country in Europe bled itself to death for one absurd reason: pride. An empire that ruled half the world and collapsed trying to maintain appearances. They spent all their gold on palaces while the people ate black bread, and when they finally fell, they dragged the entire continent into a 30-year war. The Spanish Empire didn't fall to foreign enemies. It fell because it refused to accept that the party was over. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. And tell us in the comments, do you think modern China will avoid the fate of its ancient dynasties?